Hello and welcome, and in today's video I'm going to share with you the top 10 boss creatures in 2024, as there's so many exciting options out there. So let's get straight into it. In at number 10 we have got the Megalosaurus, and this creature is here just because it really does do a good job for defeating Rockwell and Arboration, and it is just generally quite a nice boss creature overall as well. You can definitely do some things with it and it works really nicely, at least in all the cases that I've used it in. It's very reliable and it deals quite a hefty amount of damage, which definitely does play to its advantage. It has a very nice amount of health and its mobility is great as well, and although I'm pretty sure they don't have any kind of pack buff, they do deal some kind of bleed ability, but probably not to bosses, only really to small creatures, as is evident there. But it's not really a bleed ability, it's some different kind of sustained damage, so maybe scratch that point. But they can deal some sustained damage to smaller creatures. Obviously nothing too special you could say from these creatures in a regard to special abilities, but they are very well rounded, nice, and just generally good creatures to use for doing any kind of boss fight. Next up we have got the utan, and would it really be a bosses list of 2024, of course, without the UT being involved? This is just seemingly, to me at least, a very crucial creature to do any kind of boss fights with. It's just so nicely laid out, and its abilities work in such a way that in the boss arena you could be taking less damage and dealing even more. And obviously that ability is the courage roar, and it gives you a nice job to do as just a player, especially if you're going solo in a boss fight, apart from simply just clicking a button and attacking things. It adds a new, also just general dimension of fun to the game, which I wouldn't really expect to be saying for boss fights in Ark, as they tend to be just quite spam click. But there's a lot more that you can kind of do with this creature, and you feel like you're doing a lot more than just sitting somewhere and clicking. And obviously they do give you quite a hefty advantage in the boss arena, so it's definitely a no-brainer to get one, and they're just so good. You can't really live without a UT, and yes, the adodon's there as well for you, but you know, they're not always really necessary, whereas I find the UT is, especially for those more classical bosses. Next up we have got the megatheum, and thinking back on it, I might have put the UT in our higher point, but these do kind of do a bit more than what a UT would do in the boss fight, so I guess they do deserve a higher place on this list, of course. And when looking at a creature like this, they are very good at defeating the Broodmother, and that's found on many maps, not just the island, and obviously included with some other bosses which you'll find. But still, that insect buff that you'll get, insect rage, something along those lines, that you get from killing insects, of course, is just truly an amazing ability, which you can't deny is one of huge usefulness just for defeating any bug boss. And it really does just help out, and these creatures like this are just really good for things like that, and it has to be put in here for it. It cannot be demoted for this ability, as it is a very useful one, and I really do enjoy using these things, not even just for insect bosses. They do quite hefty amounts of damage as well, and their health is pretty reasonable, so I would still use these things in some rare occasions for those non-insect bosses if it was really all I had. So they are actually in some ways quite versatile boss creatures. Next up we have got the Theory, and no, this isn't just on the list because its shadow was unlocked at level 69.
Nice.
This creature is here just because it's so nice in the boss arena. Just generally across all things, Theories deal a lot of damage, and although they're a bit of a pain to heal up, requiring sweet vegetable cake to really get the job fully done, a adodon can do a lot of the work for you in quite a lot of cases, unless that boss is really doing tons and tons of damage. And also with a boss like the dragon, it has a special advantage because it's a herbivore, not a carnivore, so that flame ability isn't not going to deal too much damage to these creatures. And on top of that, they are very mobile as well, and just versatile outside of bosses, so it is a no-brainer for them being just a great boss creature. But it's also, it gives you more incentive to sustain them as well, because they're great all-rounders just across arc in general, so you know that is going to be extremely useful to you and for you, and they are just really great in the boss arena as well for all those reasons that I stated. Just really nice, useful creatures capable of so much in the boss arena, and also their shadow was unlocked at the absolute perfect level. Next up, we have got the Kronosaurus, and this is just that essential boss creature for doing any of the extinction bosses, and it really is such a hard hitting damage dealer for those things that it does definitely have to be included on this list. The Giga, technically you could put in this spot as well, but I find it's a lot less reliable than the Kronosaurus due to that rage meter. It kind of enacts as that having even less health than it actually does. It's like a fake health stat in a way, because it doesn't actually have that much health, as it's not going to fight for you for all of that health, of course. And although it doesn't really matter too much for the Alpha King Titan, as creatures like that will die quite quickly anyway, so it's not the biggest issue out there. It does matter more for those other Titans where, you know, you'll probably be facing that at points, whereas with the Kronosaurus, you simply won't. And yes, they are a little bit more of a stretch to tame. They really aren't the most difficult in the world, and they are just so much more reliable than things like Gigas, and once their blood rages up to the fullest that it can be, they do even more damage than the Giga. So in my opinion, it's an absolute no-brainer to have one of these creatures in your roster for doing any kind of bosses. Next up, we have got the Rex, and for just that most classic boss creature, it really did have to be on the list. This creature is just so capable for any kind of boss, really, unless you're fighting the mode, then you want something like a Modes or a Meg. None of those creatures are on the list, by the way, but you can use a creature which is later on the list for the Moda boss, which actually is quite preferable for me, but still, those would be really useful. Obviously, the Rex wouldn't be useful there, but for everything else, also apart from the extinction bosses, now that I think about it, this creature is extremely great, and it's just an amazing all-rounder, and it really does deserve to be on the list, especially at this level, as you know, the Rex is so widely used around, and you know, because of that, it needs to be on the list. But it's very well rounded as a creature. Great health, great damage, maybe not the best mobility, but you don't really need that in the boss fight. It is a hard, heavy damage dealing creature, a bit of a weird sentence, with a healthy amount of health, which obviously aids it in any boss fight scenario. And you know, that's why it's just such a popular boss creature still to this day, especially with X-Rectors on Gen 1. You have yourself even more variety, and with their ease of taming on ASA, it really is a no-brainer to get yourself one for doing any kind of bosses. Next up, we have got the Spinosaurus, and I just really like this creature for doing any kind of classical bosses, and also for the Moda as well. Works really effectively, works pretty nicely for the Master Controller boss, although I would use things like Rexes because of their higher health stat, which the Spino doesn't have, because that boss is quite lengthy and it really will drain a lot of health out of your creatures. So you want a creature with a lot of health, which obviously the Rex does offer, and if you had some highly mutated Spinos, then you could definitely get by, and you could even get by with just some non-mutated Spinos in cases on Gamma. But if you're doing it on Alpha, you'll definitely need that extra health. It is pretty much just necessary, really. It just needs to be there. But for other things, this really does just excel. It's got more mobility, and it deals more damage than something like the Rex, and obviously it does attack faster as well, and it is again very mobile in the water, making it a great option for the Moda boss. But you can obviously use Moses, and you can use Megalodons as well, and whatever your preferred underwater combat creature is. But I find Spinos work quite nicely. If you haven't tried it out before, I would definitely recommend that you do at some point. So they're just really versatile creatures, and that is why they need to be on this list for me. They're just very versatile, great for classical bosses, great for any underwater boss that you might face as well. Obviously not going to be great for those extinction bosses and those really lengthy ones, as it doesn't really have the health in most cases to stay alive most of the fight. A mutated one will be able to do it. In at number 3, we have got the Allosaurus, and this creature's here just because it is so nice to use for bosses. It is a very fast, speedy, agile creature, which is particularly easy to tame on ASA, considering that you can just take them from a baby, you can just kill the parents and then boom, simple as that. But they're not really a stretch to tame on ASE either, and they are a go-to boss creature, especially if you struggle to get your hands on things like Rexters, although that's not too common in case, considering how easy they are to just tame anyway, even without a trap. Actually, considering they're not particularly fast, you probably will want a trap for things like Allos, as they are particularly fast, but you can easily track down which one is the highest level in a given pack without even, using anything like a spyglass, because they got the alpha pack buff. But you'll probably want to tame all 3 in one go, and you've got yourself 3 Allos like that, and it is very easy to tame them in bulk, which obviously does aid them for bosses. They're easier to get to fight in bosses, and they deal a bleed ability, which obviously does just hugely aid them. They don't deal bleed ability to bosses, but they can deal bleed ability to just general other creatures as well, and they also do have the pack buff too, so they're going to be boosted in that way. And if you boost it on top of that with a UT as well, you're going to be dealing out some serious damage, and obviously that's why they are just so great for all of it. They are just heavy damage dealers, and although maybe they don't have the highest amount of health compared to some other creatures on this list, they do have a very reasonable amount of health, and obviously their mobility and damage makes them very effective boss creatures, and you should definitely try them at some point if you haven't already. In at number 2, we've got the Shadowman, and this creature's here just because it is so widely usable across all classical traditional bosses, and it deals tons of damage in a pack, insane, and they have mobility like you've probably never really even seen before, unless you've obviously seen Shadowmans before, which is probably most of you out there, but it's just more of an expression, a term of phrase, if you will. And these creatures are just so widely used across all of Ark that they really do have to be on this list for me, especially in boss fights. The go-to for doing Rockwell on Gen 2, and for all the classical bosses that find across the islands, Ragnarok, Fjorda, Valguero, all of those things, they really do pack a huge punch. They can even do the bosses on Fjorda at a bit of a push, especially if you get some higher level ones, and they can be used for the Moda as well, considering that they are some pretty decent underwater creatures. And if you are thinking, by the way, why aren't the Titans and other creatures like this on the list? Yes, they are very good boss creatures, but only for one specific boss, and I'm not really going to include them as they aren't full permanent tames. And in number 1, we have got the Deinonychus, and this creature is here just because it is my all-time favourite boss creature, and it probably will be my all-time favourite boss creature just throughout all of Ark and all of my life, really. I can't see any other creature replacing this. It is so mobile, and it deals hefty amounts of bleed damage, and bleed damage to bosses too, as it can latch onto them, and it's just so crippling to their health. You can mash through bosses with absolute ease with no issues whatsoever. And obviously they do have the pack buff as well. If you get a pack of them, you can really deal some serious damage over very short periods of time with these things, and that's what they are really useful. You don't really use them over longer bosses, as their health can be a little bit lackluster for some bosses that maybe last half an hour, 20 minutes in some cases. But if you get some really good health mutations on them, then you can definitely last that easily, especially considering how much damage they do. But when it's more minigame based, then it takes a little bit more effort to use these creatures in a fight, and maybe something like a Rex or with something with more health will be more advisable. But for everything else, these creatures are insanely useful. They are incredibly fast, mobile, just great all-rounders outside of bosses as well. Inside of bosses, they deal bleed damage, and they have the pack buff, and if you pair that on top of with UT buffs, you can really have yourself an insane army of creatures at your disposal, which are the boss killing champions of the game, so that's why they're so advisable. But anyway, that is the end of today's video, and I hope you enjoyed, as I definitely did enjoy making it. As always, comment down below what is the favourite boss creature of yours in 2024, and if you didn't agree with this, put your 10 in the comments below, and I'll see you all later.